Greetings ladies and gents, welcome back to the Craft Hammer. I'm your host Stefan, and in today's video, as before, we're doing a small mini tutorial to help you, the new beginner, figure out some of the basics for the hobby. In this video particular, we are going to be looking at painting. Nothing too pro related, we're not going to be doing anything too fancy. We are going to help you, the new beginner, make sure that you understand some of the basics for getting paint on your models to make sure that they are ready for your first few games. Painting tutorials can of course get a bit long, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to limit it to just the points that you need to know, very small amount, and we're going to skip some of the parts where I'm actually painting so that you're not just watching me paint for the whole time. So what you need to do is first and foremost, make sure that you get yourself a little paintbrush, a painting handle where you're going to put your model on top. Trust me, you don't want to be handling your model after you prime it and get your hands on them, maybe some grease, maybe some oils, or whatever else. You don't want to get your model dirty and you don't want to rub off any paint. Now, the first point that I want to put is, of course, make sure that you're painting in layers. What exactly do I mean? We want to look at the crevices and the nooks and crannies of the model. Make sure you put your paint in there before you go to the top, and we'll show you how that will work out at the end once we do the model and throughout the few steps. So what we're going to do, contrast Black Legion into the base to get that started. The main reason we do that is because in this scenario the base has two sections. It has the nooks and crannies where you can't really see those details, so they're not that important, but then you have this interesting grill on top. It would not make sense to paint the grill on top and then the parts inside, hence why I say paint in layers. We're going to paint the bottom layer, which is those nooks and crannies, before we paint the grill on top, and that's how we're going to do a lot of the painting on this model overall and the approach that we're going to take. So let's get into painting that now. Now, with the base done, with the little parts there, let's talk about contrast paints before we paint the majority of the armor. The thinner your contrast paint is, or the less you have on your brush, the more like it will act as a wash, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's more of a stain than a color that will fully cover the model itself. This can be used to your advantage in certain scenarios, and we will show you after we do some of the other base paints what we're going to do with a very thin contrast paint. What we will do for this model is go on the opposite side and go very thick. What we want is a thick layer of paint, of contrast paint. We will start from the bottom of the foot going up on each of the feet, making sure that we only go over the panels once, because unlike other paints, contrast paints do dry much quicker as they are a lot thinner than your traditional paint, and as such, if you go back over the paint that you've just done, it normally creates this sticky layer as it is drying, and you might start tearing that sticky layer, which in turn will leave some not great looking marks. So make sure that once you're doing it, by section, thick, one coat going up, because gravity will take effect and bring the contrast paint into the crevices naturally as it dries. So that's why we're starting from the bottom up, and let's get into it and we'll show you how this model will turn out with the red on afterwards. Now that we've achieved a nice coat of red on this model, still a tiny bit drying up, so we'll just leave that going. We're gonna do two more contrast paints, the black rubber bits in between the armor plates and some brown for the little pouches that are around the body. You may be asking, why didn't we do the black first and did red anyway? So even though I suggested that you paint it in layers, making sure that you get the crevices first, in this scenario, what we wanted to do is make sure that we get a nice even coat of the red going all over the model, which would have spilled in, as you can see, in some of those areas. It's much easier to just put a tiny bit of black contrast paint now afterwards when the armor has been smoothed out for the red, and we won't really get any on the actual plates themselves. A tiny exception, but overall we will still be painting in layers. As you can see, there's still things that will be painted on top that will not affect the red armor plate. So let's get into the other two contrast paints and get this done up. Now we've completed our little task with the remainder of the contrast paints. Might not be that easily visible as they are a bit dark, but let's discuss the other paints that we have here, which are metallics and normal paints, normal acrylic paints. What is the difference in using these? A lot of recommendations that you will see online are to use your acrylic paints on a wet palette, as the thinner the paint is, in other words, if you add a bit of extra water, normally you have a bit more control. It's much easier to do a thin coat of paint, judge to see how it looks on the model, and then add another extra layer of paint. While if you were using a thick layer of paint, you would lose some of the details, and it's much more difficult to strip the paint off and have to redo the whole model because you might have gotten rid of some of your details. Now, there's plenty of tutorials out there on wet palettes, so we're not really going to be doing anything about that. Metallic paints, on the other hand, are also an interesting paint, and they are a bit more difficult to work with than your normal acrylic one, just because it is a tiny bit thicker and it does have those grainy flakes inside if they're not properly mixed, so they will be a bit more difficult to work with. But I would definitely not recommend putting them on a wet palette, as that will destroy the consistency and make it very difficult to use them. What we're going to do on the model is, of course, put some of these paints on top. As we mentioned earlier, we will try to do layers, but in this scenario, what is going to happen is that, for example, the little knee pad here, we're going to be doing yellow first there and then the gold trim on top. While if we go to the gun here, we're going to be doing the metals around and then the yellow on top there. So we can't do one paint and fully finish with it. We will have to switch back and forth depending on the layer of the actual piece where we're painting. But overall, let's put on some of these layers, make it nice, and roughly we're going to be getting towards the end of the painting stage. And what we'll do is, let's start off with Balthazar Gold, which will help make some of the base metal and then some of the bits on top. So let's get that one out of the way, and then we'll just give you a quick look at the model as it goes. The metallics, well, two of the metallics have now been done, as we can see on the weapon there, and on the little grenade, and of course on the base. What we're going to do now is put the grey on the shoulder pads, yellow for the knee pads and the little shield, and we're going to go with some Zandri dust for the purity seal on the back. So let's get that up and painted. It's not much, but it's honest work. We now have the other paints all down. I know that the yellow looks a bit off at the moment. Maybe it's not really that visible on the camera itself, but don't worry, we will be fixing that with a few little tricks in the next video, so make sure to stay tuned for that. For now, we will focus on finishing off this model with a bit of gold to get the trim all done up before it will be ready for some washes and some highlights. Don't forget to thin those paints. It's easier to build up to the smoothness and the texture that you want than it is if you go too thick and then you have to try and fix it as you've already, maybe blocked out a few details. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video. Let's quickly put on the trim and then we'll see what it looks like. The base paint of the models have now all been put on it. Hopefully this comes across pretty well on the camera. Not too bad. Obviously, the model itself is not fully complete. There's still a few more steps to do. In the next video, we will talk about highlights and washes, and then after that, we will look at decals. Hopefully, this video has helped you out with a few basic techniques. Nothing too major. Obviously, there's a bunch of videos out there, 1,000,001 different types of painting videos with multitude of techniques and ways to complete this. Just remember, what's important is that you get some models painted so that you can put them on the battlefield against your opponent. Of course, if you are looking to become a pro artist, there's probably better channels for that. Otherwise, don't worry, you don't need to know every single technique out there so that you can paint a basic model. Also, don't forget to keep in mind some nice contrasting colors. You don't want everything of the model itself to be super dark. This is why I decided to choose the grey shoulder pads. It really helps contrast the model itself with the gold trim. And of course, yellow and red works really well. In this case, because the primer itself was a bit darker than I usually have, I normally go for a lighter color. The red itself did come out a bit more darker, and that's one of the things that you will notice when it comes to contrast. It does depend on the color that's underneath, so if you have something that is primed dark, the contrasts themselves will also come out a bit darker. So if you are looking for brighter, more vibrant contrast colors, make sure to prime your model with a light primer. For now, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, make sure you like this video, stay tuned for the next one, and until next time, take care folks.